Well, as promised, I'm going to be discussing the millennium found in Revelation chapter 20. Now, to say that there has been an awful lot of ink spilled on the issue of the millennium is a humongous understatement. In many ways, the millennium is considered to be the key, the critical key of interpreting the book of Revelation. Now, there are basically two major views concerning the millennium. There's the view of the millennium beginning in the first century during the ministry of Christ. In Matthew chapter 12, he cast a demon out of a young man. He was accused of doing so by the power of the devil. And Jesus said, how do you spoil the goods of the strong man unless you first enter his house and you bind him? And of course he said, a house divided against itself cannot stand. If I, by the power of the devil, cast out the devil, then a house is divided. So it's believed that at least at this point, and then in Luke chapter 10, when he sent his apostles out on one of the limited commissions, and they healed and they cast out demons, they came back rejoicing, and Jesus said, well, rejoice that your names are written in heaven. But he said, I beheld Satan cast down from heaven. So once again, it is believed, based upon these two passages, and perhaps some others, that the millennium began during the ministry of Jesus. Some say that it began with his resurrection and his triumph over Satan, as he said in John chapter 12, 31 and following. Now is the judgment of this world. Now is the God of this world to be cast out. And so that is one view. I was personally raised in the amillennial view of the millennium, which took the view that I just described. And the millennium is defined as the entirety of the Christian age. This is essentially the amillennial as well as the postmillennial view. Both of those positions believe and teach that the second coming of Christ, the new heaven and the new earth, comes at the end of the millennium. They are both, therefore, what can be described as post-millennial. Then, of course, we have what is known as the premillennial view, both historic and dispensational. In this view, the millennium does not begin until the coming of the Lord. And so, in both views, or I should say in the dispensational view, the millennium is strictly future. In the amillennial and postmillennial view, the millennium is viewed as present. There are some variations of these views, and I'll even mention a variation, a third view here momentarily. But most consider the millennium to be an extended, long period of time. As just mentioned, the amillennialists and postmillennialists view the entirety of the Christian age as the millennium. Well, that means the millennium's been going on for 2,000 years. The dispensationalists have a tendency to literalize the language and to say that it is, in fact, a literal 1,000 years, or, give or take a few years. I am going to present the view that the millennium was a roughly 40-year period of time. And by the way, I'm going to be saying that several times that the millennium ended in AD 70. I'm not trying to be exactly precise in that, because I will understand that the end of the millennium is the judgment and the coming of the Lord. But according to Revelation chapter 20 and verse 8, you have an outburst of persecution at the end of the millennium, and that outburst of persecution is terminated by the coming of the Lord. And so you technically have the end of the millennium, persecution, coming of the Lord. So again, I'm not trying to be precise when I say that the millennium ended in AD 70. I'm giving if you please, a generic terminus, but nonetheless, I am speaking of, in general terms, a 40-year millennium. And I believe that the millennium corresponds with what is known in the scholarly literature to the second Exodus. As the first Exodus was approximately 40 years in length, in leaving Egypt, going into the wilderness, wandering for 40 years before entering into the promised land, Joshua chapter 5. In the book of Revelation, we have the second Exodus developed extensively. Listen, there is a wealth of material out there for those who are interested in pursuing this study that demonstrate how pervasive the ideas, the motifs, even the terminology of the first Exodus is found in the book of Revelation. And I really truly believe that the second Exodus holds much of the key to properly understanding that the 1,000 years is actually a 40-year period of time. And, I'm not going to go into tremendous detail on that. However, I would recommend that you get Joseph Vincent's excellent book, The Millennium, Past, Present, or Future. Joseph done a fantastic job in that book. I understand that Joseph is currently revising and editing and enlarging that. I was honored to be able to write one chapter in that book. And it's my plan that at some point of time in the future, and I'll be taking a slightly different tack than Joseph does in his book, but I intend, Lord willing, and I get to live long enough, I intend to produce my own book that will incorporate a lot of the material that I'm going to share with you today in demonstration of the 40-year millennium. But be sure to get your own copy of Joseph Vincent's book on the millennium, past, present, or future. It is in the bookstore that Alan Morton has set up for the conference. Now, here's my premise. My premise is really quite simple, but it is really, really important to understand. What I'm going to share is going to be focused on just one of many, many arguments that I believe are definitive and powerful in proving the 40-year millennium. Now, I will share with you this. I am not aware of any commentary that approaches the millennium in the way that I'm going to suggest it to you today. And as I have said on many occasions in the past, it absolutely scares me to death to present ideas and concepts and arguments that I cannot find at least the germ stated by some other writer. Listen, J. Stuart Russell, in his book, The Parousia, struggled with the concept of the millennium. He never considered the idea, never considered the argument that I'm going to present to you here today. And so while I certainly agree, I have stated on many, many occasions, we today are standing on the shoulders of the earlier giants. And yet, the millennium is a study that, to my knowledge, and listen, I easily confess that this may be a matter of my own personal ignorance. It may be that others have essayed on the subject as I'm going to present it to you, and that I simply have not been able to find them, even though I've examined a large number of commentaries, articles, PDFs, and what have you. I simply have not found anyone else that approaches the millennium in the way that I'm going to share it with you today. Thus, there is a reason, I believe there's a good solid reason why no one has essayed on the 40-year millennium in the way that I'm going to do it. Now, obviously, there are some who take the 40-year millennium. Joseph Vincent has done so. But I believe there's a really good reason why so many, the vast majority of commentators, do not even consider the idea of a 40-year millennium. Even though, by the way, there were some ancient rabbis who believed that the millennium was going to be 40 years. And that reason is very simple. It is universally believed and held and taught, number one, that the millennium is a long period of time. And number two, it is assumed, basically without argumentation, that the millennium, or that the end of the millennium, is still future. So the two premises that underlie the futurist views are so fundamentally based upon assumptions. Number one, the millennium is a long period of time. Number two, the end of the millennium is yet future. And because of those assumptions, none of the futurist views seem to be willing to even consider the fact that the millennium was a short period of time, a symbolic reference to a perfect period of time. They seem not to have considered that it might be related to the second Exodus, even though, strangely enough, many commentators take note of the second Exodus motif in the book of Revelation. So my question is, if so many commentators take note of the second Exodus motif in the book of Revelation, why in the world do they not see that the end of the second Exodus is the entrance into the new creation, which it certainly was for the first Exodus and Israel entering into the promised land? Why do they not consider that the end of the second Exodus is the time of the resurrection from the dead, which Israel's deliverance from Egypt was resurrection from the dead? Why do these commentaries never consider these issues? Well, once again, I believe that it has to do with the fact that these commentators are so convinced that the millennium must be a long period of time, and that the end of the millennium is therefore at the end of the millennium is a long way off. Therefore, they never consider the things that I am going to share with you. So my lesson is going to focus on a very specific motif that is undeniable, all right? And it's not only undeniable, it's admitted by all of these scholars who talk about the yet future end of the millennium. They admit the very motif that I'm going to share with you. And the reason they admit it is because it's right in the text of Revelation chapter 20, verse 8 and following. And that motif is this: the destruction of creation occurs at the end of the millennium. Now listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. All futurists, all of them, agree that heaven and earth is destroyed at the end of the millennium. Now, they are divided as to whether or not the creation is actually destroyed, right down to the very elements. That's the kind of view that was in my fellowship of the churches of Christ, that the earth and the elements therein shall be burned up, not renovated, not restored, completely destroyed. But then there is the other view, sometimes known as the Reformed amillennial or the postmillennial view, and that is that the earth will actually be renovated, restored. And the commentators appeal to Romans chapter 8, 21 and following for that view. But the bottom line is they are divided as to whether or not creation is actually destroyed or renovated, but they posit the destruction, they posit the renovation at the end of the current age or at the end of the millennium. In spite of that consensus, all right, in spite of that almost universal consensus, I believe that there is an incredible wealth of material that supports the idea of a 40-year millennium. So, I'm going to begin with what I've just stated. And that is something that is admitted by all futurist paradigms, and that is that the destruction of heaven and earth is posited at the end of the millennium. So here's my argument, okay? I want you to follow along very carefully with my argument. Point number one, the destruction of creation in the book of Revelation occurs at the end of the millennium. Now, I'll give you the text here momentarily. However, the destruction of creation in Revelation occurs at the time of the destruction of Babylon, the harlot city guilty of persecuting the saints, shedding all of the blood shed on the earth. In other words, to put this in another way, the end of the millennium is the time of the vindication of the martyrs. Now, let me reiterate this premise, okay? The destruction of creation of Revelation chapter 20 occurs at the time of the judgment of Babylon, the great persecuting power. We might put this as another way. The destruction of heaven and earth occurs at the time of the destruction of Satan, the great persecutor. But you see, Satan and Babylon were, well, I'll use the terminology, were partners. So the destruction of Satan and the destruction of Babylon are synchronous events. They both occur at the same time, i.e., at the end of the millennium. Third point. Babylon, in the book of Revelation, is Old Covenant Jerusalem. Therefore, the destruction of creation in the book of Revelation comes at the end of the millennium, at the judgment of Old Covenant Jerusalem, which in the book of Revelation is identified as the adversary, i.e., Satan. Let me read that one more time. Therefore, the destruction of creation in Revelation comes at the end of the millennium. That's undeniable in Revelation 28 and following. But it occurs at the judgment and the destruction of Babylon, the adversary, the Satan of God. So, we need to look at, and look, I'm sharing with you some important hermeneutical issues to set the context for what I'm going to develop during the rest of my presentation. When it comes to the book of Revelation, the eschatological world is divided into two camps. Number one, Revelation is viewed, and all of the visions, it's actually one vision, and John is made clear to know that, okay? There's only one vision. That alone should tell us something very important. But nonetheless, the futurist view of Revelation is divided into two camps, two views of the apocalypse. Number one, what is known as the recapitulatory perspective, and that is, the book of Revelation is, as I just suggested, a single vision, but that vision, that singular vision, is repeated, recapitulated, over and over and over again. In other words, the vision of the seals is repeated under the trumpets. And that in turn is reiterated in the vials. They are not different visions of different times, different events, stretched out. You know, the historicist view, which is the view I was taught in preacher school, stretches the book of Revelation out into millennia. I mean, spanning the entire vast scope of the last 200 years, extending into who knows how far into the future. And so they see it as sequential, just like the dispensationalists do. As a general rule, the premillennial view sees the book of Revelation as sequential. We have the seals, then we have the trumpets, then we have the vials. Strangely enough, they see the book of Revelation as focused primarily on a 7-year period of time. Now that means that we've got all these visions, they make it plural instead of singular like the book says, all unfolding within an incredibly short period of time. But, as we shall see, if the book of Revelation is recapitulatory, that is the same vision presented in different ways, then there is but one destruction of creation in the book. However, to return to the dispensational view just mentioned, if the book is chronologically sequential, there must of necessity be at least 3, do you catch the power of this? There must be at least 3 destructions of heaven and earth in the book of Revelation. Now look, I'm not aware of any dispensational or premillennial view that admits and agrees and teaches that there are 3 destructions of creation in the book of Revelation. But, once again, if you take the book as sequential, chronologically sequential, you are absolutely forced to do so. Because as we will illustrate as we go along in my presentations, there are 3 mentions of the destruction of creation in the book of Revelation, beginning with chapter 6, ending in chapter 20. Therefore, if chapter 6 is followed by sequentially chapter 16, for instance, which is followed sequentially and chronologically by chapter 20, then of absolute necessity, you have to have 3 destructions of heaven and earth. And yet, to my knowledge, no dispensationalist, no premillennialist has ever taught that. So I want to suggest to you that neither view can sustain a future into the millennium or destruction of creation based upon the argument, my preliminary argument that I hope that you have written down. So let's take a look at Revelation. Now I'm going to begin with Revelation chapter 20, all right? May not be the proper place to start, but I want to start with something that is absolutely admitted by everyone. And that is that the destruction of heaven and earth occurs at the end of the millennium. Now, you need to star this, you need to underline it, you need to put it in caps, that everyone agrees that the destruction of creation occurs at the end of the millennium. Let's begin reading with Revelation chapter 20 and verse 8. When the 1,000 years are expired, where does this put us? At the end of the millennium. Now, John sees the rebellion that takes place for a little while, fire coming down from heaven, destroying the enemies of the body of Christ, and then we have the great white throne judgment. So, when the 1,000 years are expired, John says, then I saw a great white throne, and the one who sat on it, from whose face earth and heaven fled away, and there was no place found for them. I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. So here's what we have in the book of Revelation, specifically in chapter 20. We have the great white throne judgment. When? At the end of the millennium. This is why I am starting at chapter 20, because this is absolutely incontrovertible. At that judgment, the great white throne judgment, the earth and the heaven fled away. So, end of the millennium, destruction of creation. At that judgment, at the end of the millennium, at the destruction of heaven and earth, the resurrection takes place. At that time, the dead are rewarded. Now, folks, the dead here are the martyrs of Revelation 20, 1 to 4. That means that Revelation chapter 20 is also the time of the vindication of the martyrs. And thus, heaven and earth pass away at the judgment, the resurrection, and the time of the vindication of the martyrs. Now, let me digress here for just a moment, all right? To address the issue that some believe that the millennium began in AD 70. Just very recently on Facebook, I have been accosted by 2 or 3 different people, and I use that word accost because they were pretty harsh in their criticism. But nonetheless, they take the view, accusing me of ignorance, and I may be, but accusing me of ignorance and false doctrine, blah, 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 by positing the 40-year millennium and trying to argue that the millennium began in AD 70. Now, they believe this. They believe that Revelation 21 to 4, which is obviously the beginning of the millennium, speaks of the vindication of the martyrs of Christ in AD 70. They equate Revelation 6, the giving of the robes to the martyrs, who were told to rest for just a little while. So they equate the sitting on the thrones and waiting for the great judgment, waiting for the vindication, with the receiving of the robes as they wait for their vindication. But they believe that Revelation 6, the giving of the robes, Revelation 20, the sitting on the thrones, was in AD 70, and that as a result of that, we have been in the millennium ever since. Now, some who take this position believe that the millennium is unending. Well, that can't be true according to Revelation 20 and verse 8, but nonetheless, I want you to pay very careful attention to what I'm about to share with you. Jesus posited the vindication of the martyrs at his coming in judgment of Jerusalem. Now, listen to me. He posited the vindication of the martyrs at AD 70. Matthew 21, the Lord of the vineyard would come against the wicked vineyard workers and destroy them. He would come and destroy them, vindicating the death of his servants and vindicating the death of his son. Matthew chapter 22, the invitation to the wedding went out. The servants who took that invitation were persecuted. The Father sent out his armies, his representatives, it's his coming, and they destroy the city. Matthew chapter 23, Jesus said that all of the blood of all of the righteous shed upon the earth from righteous Abel unto Zacharias, son of Barachias, would be vindicated in his generation. There is no question whatsoever that the vindication of the martyrs would be in AD 70. But watch this carefully. In Revelation 6, the martyrs are given robes after they cry out for vengeance. They are given robes and told to wait. To wait on what? Vindication. Robes given, waiting for vindication. So once again, in Revelation 6, the martyrs are given robes and told to await their vindication at the great day of the Lord's wrath. They were, therefore, after receiving their robes, waiting for AD 70 and the coming of the Lord. Likewise, the great day of the Lord's wrath is therefore the day of their vindication, but that is not the scene of Revelation 6, nor is it the scene of Revelation 21-4. To put this another way, AD 70 was the great day of God in vindication of the martyrs. But in Revelation 6 and in Revelation 20, the vindication of the martyrs, listen, the actual vindication awaits after they receive their robes, after they are seated on the thrones. They are given robes to wait for vindication. They are seated on the thrones to wait for vindication. Their vindication comes after they receive the thrones and the crowns, and their vindication comes at the end of the millennium and at the great day of the Lord. Now, all of that means that the great white throne judgment, which is after the millennium, is the time of the vindication. That means that in Revelation 6, after receiving their robes, they were waiting for the end of the millennium and the great day of God's wrath, the time of their vindication. It means that in Revelation 20, after being seated on thrones, they were waiting for their vindication that would come at the judgment at the end of the millennium. They were waiting for vindication. Revelation 21-4 is not AD 70. Revelation 6, 9-11 is not AD 70. It is the depiction of the saints, the martyrs, waiting for their vindication, which would occur at the end of the millennium. Now, once again, heaven and earth pass away at the great judgment. It is at that judgment that the martyrs are vindicated. To put this another way, heaven and earth passes away at the vindication of the martyrs. So what do we see? What do we see here in Revelation chapter 20? And boy, I'm running out of time really fast here. Okay. In Revelation chapter 20, here's what we have. The resurrection occurs at the end of the millennium. Nobody denies that. The judgment, and by the way, folks, let me just say this. In the Old Testament, vindication of martyrdom is depicted as resurrection. Now, since resurrection occurs at the end of the millennium, then since resurrection is depicted very often as vindication, that means that vindication at the day of the Lord, once again, did not occur at the giving of the robes or the seating on the thrones. It occurs after the millennium. But I could go on and on about that, but I don't have time. Okay, so the resurrection occurs at the end of the millennium. The judgment occurs at the end of the millennium. Nobody doubts that, right? The destruction of Satan occurs at the end of the millennium. Now listen, I've just got to make a statement or two right here. In Revelation chapter 12, Satan is depicted as the great serpent. That goes back to Isaiah chapter 27, Leviathan. Leviathan being destroyed. When? Verses 10 and following, when the fortified city would be destroyed, when the altar of the temple would be turned to chalkstone, when the people whom the Lord had created would no longer find mercy, in fulfillment of Deuteronomy chapter 32, the song of Moses, which is about Israel's last days, not about the end of time, not about the end of the Christian age. So, here in Revelation chapter 12, just like in Isaiah 26 and 27, Satan is depicted as the great enemy of God. Why? For persecuting the saints. So while, quote, Satan is depicted as the great persecutor in chapter 12, who is the great persecutor in Revelation 6, in Revelation 11, in Revelation 16, in Revelation 18 and 19? It is none other than Babylon. And thus, as I stated in my recent debate with Sam Frost, Satan means adversary. It means enemy, one who stands against. To deny that old covenant Babylon was, quote, Satan, the enemy and the adversary of God in the book of Revelation, flies against everything that the book of Revelation has to say. So I would like to develop that an awful lot more. I think that Scott Fisher is going to develop this concept, so I don't want to walk on him too terribly much. But I do want to notice this. I pointed out in my debate with Sam Frost, when he scoffed at the idea of Satan being destroyed in AD 70, I said, well, the problem is that Paul said in Romans chapter 16 and verse 20, and now the God of peace shall crush Satan under your feet shortly. And by the way, it's not unknown at all in the commentaries for the scholars to understand that Paul was not talking about a spiritual being, but the enemy of God, i.e. the Jews who were persecuting the church at that time. That's not unknown at all in the literature. So this entire subject of the destruction of Satan at the end of the millennium is extremely important, but I must hasten on. So at the end of the millennium, we have the resurrection, we have the judgment, we have the destruction of Satan, and we have the avenging of the martyrs. Remember, Revelation 20, they were given robes, they were told to wait. They waited for the millennium, and at the end of the millennium, Satan, their great persecutor, is destroyed. That is their vindication, and they get to enter into the new creation at the end of the millennium. And obviously, we have the destruction of heaven and earth at the end of the millennium. Now, I don't know of anyone that denies and rejects these basic tenets. Now, obviously, Sam Frost didn't know how to deal with the destruction of Satan in the book of Revelation. He didn't know how to deal with the identity of Satan in the book of Revelation. All he could do was scoff at it, ridicule it. But folks, I want to tell you something. Ridicule is not refutation, as I've pointed out many, many times. So once again, few commentators disagree with the assessment that I've just given of the constituent elements that are found in Revelation chapter 20, all of which occur at the end of the millennium. Now, we need to set the stage for our next passage, our next text. The very next passage that I want to deal with is Revelation chapter 16, which discusses and describes the destruction of heaven and earth. Now, it doesn't mention the millennium, all right? And it doesn't say destruction of heaven and earth. I'll have more to say about that. But in order to understand Revelation 16, we have to set the context, and the context is actually set in Revelation 15. But notice first that Revelation 16, 17 to 21 is the outpouring of the seventh bowl, the seventh vial of the wrath of God. And that wrath of God, that outpouring of the seventh bowl, is depicted as the great day of God's wrath. And catch the power of this. That great day of God's wrath in Revelation 16, in the outpouring of the seventh bowl, is against Babylon, the great persecutor of the saints. Now then, keep that in mind, okay, as we turn back to Revelation chapter 15, in order to set the stage, in order to set the context for chapter 16. Now remember, chapter 16 is the outpouring of seven bowls, or the seventh bowl, I should say. In Revelation 15 and 8, John saw the temple of God opened in heaven, as he had seen in Revelation chapter 11, 19. In Revelation 19, he said, I saw the temple in heaven opened, and there was the ark of the testimony, the ark of the covenant, but no man could enter therein. Well, in Revelation chapter 15 and verse 8, we are told that no man could enter into that naos, naos meaning the most holy place, until the wrath of God found in the seven bowls was completed, was poured out. Okay? So, we have here in Revelation chapter 11, chapter 15, we have the motif of the seven bowls of God's wrath. The seventh bowl is the day, the great day of God's wrath. And this is what's critical. It is against Babylon, the great persecutor. But wait a minute. What does Revelation chapter 12 do? Revelation 12 identifies the great persecutor as the devil, Satan, the great serpent. So, Revelation 12, the great persecutor is Satan. Revelation 16 and 17, yes, 16 and 17, actually through 18. The great persecutor is Babylon. Satan is Babylon. Now, all of this means that no man could enter into the most holy place until the wrath of God was completely poured out against Babylon, when creation would be destroyed. But when is creation destroyed in the book of Revelation? At the end of the millennium. So let's look at this very closely in Revelation chapter 16. I'm going to read verses 4 to 7 and then 18 to 20 for time's sake. The third angel, that's the third bowl, poured out his vial upon the rivers and the fountains of waters, and they became as blood. And I heard the angel of the waters say, You are righteous, O Lord, who was and are and shall be, because you have judged. For they, this is the city of Babylon, they have shed the blood of the saints and of the prophets. You have given them blood to drink. You see, this is what is known as the lex talionis, blood for blood. Pain for pain, persecution for persecution. You have given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And I heard another angel out of the altar. Now, as we're going to see, the altar is critical because it's under the altar where the martyrs are. I heard another out of the altar saying, even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are your judgments. Then the seventh angel, now, so I'm jumping ahead in time here, admittedly. Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, it is done. And there were noises and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such a mighty and great earthquake as not ever occurred since men were on the earth. Now, the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of the nations fell, and great Babylon was remembered before God, to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Now watch. Then every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. So what do we have here? We have the judging of the great persecutor, Babylon, which is the harlot city. Now, very, very quick observation. When it says that Babylon was remembered, that is from a word that indicates covenantal remembrance. It is like remembering a marriage covenant. It is far, far more than a simple, I remember when I was 12 years old, which is hard to do. But anyway, it's not just simple mental recollection. It is bringing covenant to mind. God remembered his covenant with Abraham. Do you see how important that is? God remembered Babylon. That means that he was in a covenant relationship with Babylon, and the provisions of that covenant, the provisions of wrath for her violation of that covenant, were going to be brought to bear. Now, folks, there was only one city that was ever in covenant relationship with God. And that was not the Vatican. It wasn't New York. It wasn't America. And it wasn't Rome. It was Old Covenant Jerusalem. So, we have here in Revelation chapter 16, the judging of the great persecutor Babylon, the harlot city. Now, notice that in verse 7, the altar sings praises to the Lord for vindicating the blood of the saints. So, the destruction of Babylon is the vindication of the saints, but the great white throne judgment is the vindication of the martyrs of God. This also echoes chapter 6, the souls who were under the altar crying out for vindication. So chapter 16 is just another view of their vindication at the destruction of Babylon, the slayer of the prophets and the servants of God. But watch, this is the great day of God's wrath described in Revelation 6, 12 and following. Just as it's described in Revelation 16 and 7. It is the answer to the prayer of the martyrs of chapter 6. Thus, the great day of the Lord's wrath against Babylon is the time of the vindication of the martyrs. But wait a minute. That means it's the great white throne judgment of Revelation 20, which occurs at the end of the millennium. Now watch. Oh, I got to hurry. We are told, quote, every island fled away and the mountains were not found. Obviously, the term heaven and earth is not found here as it is found in Revelation 20. But folks, we're not talking about two different judgments, two separate vindication of the martyrs, and two separate great days of the Lord. This is just typical Hebraic expressions. There is absolutely no rule of journalism that demands that every single expression, every exact word, term, or phrase be used from text to text to describe the same identical events. That's really, after all, ludicrous. But after all, if the mountains are not found, and if the islands have fled away, that is an earth-shattering event, to be sure. Well, I'm absolutely out of time. We will summarize what we have seen on Revelation 16 in my second lesson, and we will proceed from there in our survey of the book of Revelation and the end of the millennium destruction of heaven and earth. Thank you very much.